you know, oh, I'm being recorded. So, if you don't want to be recorded, you better put your hands up or take your video off. The things we say about Freemasonry, improving society one man at a time, and our principles make a difference, all those sorts of platitudes, in my view, are really just that. They're platitudes. They don't really come towards brotherly love, relief and truth, or as the McBride ritual calls it, the great aim of our order is the attainment of the universal brotherhood of man. I quite like that one. But is that really what Freemasonry is for? Willemshurst, and I couldn't quite, when I did the paper, I couldn't quite find the quotation from Willemshurst, but I know he said it, that what we're talking about in these sorts of platitudes is what every bubby should learn and mummies need. So why have an organisation like Freemasonry to be good people? Most religions, or organisations like Lions, Rotary, they're interested in charity just as much as Freemasons espouse charity. Why join Freemasonry? What is it for? And of course, these platitudes that we tell each other and we tell to the external world, obviously the point of my paper is that these are not just what Freemasonry is for. There are other things, deeper things. We say of ourselves that Freemasonry is a peculiar system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. And that's true. But even then, what does that mean? The platitudes I've been talking about, making good men better and so on, that might deal with the first part of that phraseology, a system of morality. But when we're talking about veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols, I think we can see that Freemasonry is somewhat deeper than that external sort of coating. Yes, one of the PowerPoint overheads is shaping tomorrow's leaders. Well, that's beaut, but I don't think that that's all that Freemasonry is about. So my paper, I deal with a number of potential answers, but in fact, there are a couple when on reviewing the paper, which I subsequently thought I could have included, but I haven't, and I might get to those later on if we have time. The first straw man that I'm setting up to knock down, I suppose, about what Freemasonry is for, is the lodges are to support the Grand Lodges that they draw warrants from. And I'm looking at the Victorian Constitution. Other states, of course, have got similar constitutions, but not, with variations, but not dissimilar. An intelligent external observer might say, well, Grand Lodge, that's been formed, and Grand Lodge gives the warrants to the lodges, and so the lodges are there to support the Grand Lodge. And you read the Constitution, and there's lots of bits, well, certainly in the Victorian Constitution, that might actually support that sort of proposition. But obviously that's false, because historically we know that there were lodges before any Grand Lodge was formed in 1717, if Grand Lodge, the Premier Grand Lodge was formed in 1717, and there's debate about that, I suppose. But it's quite clear that the lodges aren't there just to support Grand Lodge. There was an interesting paper which was published in Harishim, number 85 in December 2019 by Prescott and Summers, called The Origins of Freemasonry and the Invention of Tradition. And their proposition is that the Grand Lodge of London after 1717 manipulated or reinvented historical tradition to form what we know as Freemasonry today. And the argument is effectively that Freemasonry, as we understand it, was invented, and a sham was effectively perpetrated. There's been a pretty effective rebuttal of that sort of idea by Richard Berman from Quarto Coronati Lodge. When I did this paper, I didn't actually know whether his paper, which somebody had kindly sent me, had been published or not. It's called The Origins of Freemasonry and the Invention of Tradition, a Rebuttal. It has subsequently been published in Harishim, but I can't remember which edition. Last year, Brendan might know, but I just couldn't immediately lay my hands to it this afternoon. And his argument, the Berman's argument, is that while you might validly argue for a reinvention of Freemasonry along Enlightenment ideals in the early 18th century, it's not true to say that Freemasonry was a novel construction. And we can sort of debate parts of that, but certainly Freemasonry changed, but it wasn't an imagined thing. It wasn't a complete sham foisted on people. The second straw man I want to set up and then knock down is the idea that Freemasonry perpetuates secret traditions of the medieval stonemasons. This has been much written about, that in some way Freemasonry is the repository of secrets and traditions. Some argue it goes back to the Roman collegia and so on and so forth. It's a rather appealing idea, but authors many years ago, Newcomb Jones in particular, wrote many books investigating this proposition without much avail. Of course, Scotland has better evidence of the operative lodges than England does, but I think, like the evidence from continental documents, I'm thinking of the Grand Lodge of Strasbourg. I've forgotten the one in Italy. There are documents going back to the 13th century and so on. But I think there we really are dealing with operative lodges and guilds rather than speculative Freemasonry or lodges that might have speculated in some exception behind the external guilds situation. But the idea of tradition is very important, and in that sense, the ancient charges are still important. I've got, if you read the Regius Poem or the Cook manuscript or any of the early charges, it doesn't really tell you, in my view anyway, much about what Freemasonry is for. They certainly deal with the myths told by Freemasons about where Freemasonry came from, but not what it is actually for, unless you're interested in church-going behaviour or how you should behave in table. There is an argument that if you looked at Chartres Cathedral as an example, there was a cathedral school where they studied Plato's Timaeus, and which effectively was promulgating the ideas of sacred geometry and so forth. But there's very little evidence that the Freemasonry we practice has ever been involved in those concerns. Geometry does get a mention in the ritual, but that's about the size of it. The third topic that the third straw man I want to set up and knocked down is that Freemasonry is the custodian in some way of some sort of esoteric knowledge. Depending on who you want to read or quote, it's the custodian of knowledge of the Gnostics, or it was passed down from the Knights Templar, or the Cathars, or the Illuminati, or somebody else. This has been very successful from Dan Brown's point of view. Sold a lot of books on this sort of stuff, but there's very little evidence that esoteric knowledge is what Freemasonry is for. Yes, I quite like that PowerPoint. Thank you, Brendan. That's you're doing rather well there. Going back to the first transactions of the Quater Coronati Lodge in 1886, this was actually debated. William Wynne Westcott said that he gave a paper that Freemasonry was Kabbalistic. I don't have time to deal with all of his argument here, but no less an authority than Robert Freck Gould at the end of the paper, because in those days they used to publish, well, I think they still do, publish the questions and responses at the end of the paper in their transactions. And Gould took exception to the main argument of the paper. He just didn't think it was any evidence to support what Westcott was saying. There is certainly evidence, and Berman's paper is a good source of evidence, because he's looked at the lodge minutes through the 18th century pretty thoroughly. There's certainly the lodges were holding educational lectures, but they weren't esoteric in the sense that I'm using that term. They were certainly scientific lectures given to disseminate the new knowledge or education more widely. Berman notes the work of Oakley at the Three Compasses Lodge, Stukely at the Fountain Tavern Lodge, and Clare at the King's Arms Tavern Lodge. And just in the latter, just that last lodge, between 1733 and 1743, for 10 years, there were 36 lectures given in that lodge, but 9 of them explained new scientific discoveries, inventions, techniques, apparatus. Other lectures covered art, others covered architecture, others covered mathematics, but not esoteric subjects. Now, I don't want to leave that without saying something about the quotations I put in the paper from Bernard Jones. And I'll read it because I think it's important. And I'll read Stevenson's quote as well. Straight from operative to speculative in English Masonry might be to us a difficult journey, but from operative via a fraternity hidden away at the very heart of the craft and merging in the days of the Renaissance into an early form of modern symbolic Masonry, yes, that is a sequence not only natural, but perfectly credible. And Stevenson's quote, his book, The First Freemasons, the Early Lodges in Scotland, says, in the light of Hermetic ideas, the medieval myths of the Masons take on a new importance. The myths claimed that the craft had its roots in ancient Egypt, and the old charges specifically assigned Hermes Trismegistus an important role in this process. In the generations in which the great Hermetic quest swept across Europe, Masons must have taken a particular pride in the role of the godlike Hermes in their craft histories. And considering the extent of the obsession, it is not implausible to think of William Shaw as seeing one aspect of the secret lodges he created as being a grafting of the ambitions that led to the founding of secret Hermetic societies onto a craft which already claimed that it had a connection with Hermes and that some of its wisdom derived from ancient Egypt. Now, I accept what they say in those sorts of terms, but that suggests to me, and I've forgotten the Latin tag, ex propter hoc or something, but you shouldn't introduce the idea of Hermetic science from the Renaissance into the Freemasonry as existed, rather than saying that Freemasonry was a development of Hermeticism itself, which I think wouldn't be right. So there's two slightly things. You don't want to say, well, we know that there's Hermetic ideas in there somewhere, so that must be what it was for, and that's what it was set up to preserve. It's rather the idea is that these ideas came into Freemasonry at a later stage in its development. The fourth idea in my paper, which I spend probably more time on than the rest of it really, is the idea of Freemasonry being an initiatory organisation for psychological development. It's not an original idea that Freemasonry is an initiatory organisation intended to improve a man by having such a psychological effect on him as to change his outlook and view the world in a different way. I'm not an anthropologist, but there are plenty of people who discuss the anthropology of initiation. And it is true that even in today's world, there is a place for milestone events in life. Perhaps in a less religious age, people are less interested in baptism or Holy Communion or bar mitzvahs or confirmations, but these changes in status marked certain life changes, and I think that what one is after initiation is different from what one was before. I like, and really the key idea from this comes to me from Kirk McNulty's theory of psychological development in his book, Freemasonry, A Journey Through Ritual and Symbol. It's the pursuit of the knowledge of oneself. If we say Freemasonry rose out of Renaissance thought, it can derive a psychology from the symbolic structure that we have in our craft. It's a developmental psychology, and it's orientated towards the spiritual or the divine. Of course, it operates in a framework very different from modern materialism, and it's effectively based on a metaphysical system. If you think of the regular progression in science from a point to a line, from a line to a superficies, from a superficies to a solid, that is a Neoplatonic device using mathematical or geometric expressions to describe how the universe is brought into existence by God. Now, if we say that geometry is the basis of our art, things start with a point. A point moves and becomes a line. The line moves in a direction not parallel to itself and generates a plane, a superficies. The plane moves in a similar way, generating solid. The Neoplatonists used that sort of geometry.
That sounds like Crowley.
Well, I haven't quoted Crowley. He may have said something similar, but I'm not an Aleister Crowley fan, Ian, I must say. But anyway,
neither am I. But in Book of Thoth, at the beginning of
stop interrupting me. I'm going to turn you off.
I hear somebody saying something, but I wasn't sure. Yes. Where was I? There are a number of expressions, depending on who you're reading, of how the divine projects itself into existence through progressively more complex levels, if I can put it that way, from the spirit, the psyche, and finally the material world. And this metaphysical scheme has been argued you can find in the plans of Gothic cathedrals. So you have a nave and a choir and a sanctuary, but also in the dimension of consciousness considered by Renaissance scholars. It's the basis of a lot of Western philosophy, I guess. But Freemasonry, according to Kirk McNulty anyway, is concerned with the superficies, that is with the psyche. But unlike modern science, it doesn't ignore the other parts of the metaphysical system. I think Freemasonry is based on the premise that the individual who explores his psyche can explore his relationship with the divine while continuing his role in the physical world. So, obviously, a belief in a supreme being is a precondition to joining Freemasonry, but apart from that basic requirement, Freemasonry is not concerned with how the individual practices his faith. So, if you think of those different worlds, if I can put it in a Kabbalistic sense, not quite right, but you see that Freemasonry presupposes that there are levels. There you have man has a body, a psyche, a spirit, and contact with the divine source. Kirk McNulty describes this as represented by the Temple of Solomon. You can draw the parallel between the three stories in the temple, the three levels of consciousness in Jung's psychological model, for example: individual consciousness, personal unconsciousness, and the collective unconsciousness. Kirk McNulty says we shouldn't be surprised about this as far as Freemasonry is concerned, because these are studies of the same thing. It's just studies are being conducted in two different periods of Western culture, about 300 years apart. Now, if on this scheme, the entered apprentice enters the temple on the mosaic pavement, the ground floor. The fellowcraft goes to the middle chamber of the temple, and the master mason approaches the Holy of Holies, representing the other two stories on this scheme. And the ritual progress he makes is really about psychological development. The ground floor of the temple represents that part of the psyche which is in contact with the material world, to use Jungian terms, the individual consciousness. But the candidate is introduced to the idea that there are upper floors in the temple, which he will explore as he advances in the craft. The three great lights are also a physical representation of that allegorical structure. The square represents the psyche, the compass is the spirit, and the volume of the sacred law represents divinity and the divine source from which they're received. Looking at our symbols, for example, the first three tracing boards, a drawing which just seems to be a diverse collection of Masonic symbols, but it's actually an integrated picture illustrating the operation of what I'm talking about as universal principles. The law of unity is represented by the pavement of the lodge, the blazing star representing the universe as it's seen from the point of view of the deity, and the checkered pavement, how the universe appears to us in the physical world: active, passive, light, dark, good, bad. And this law of duality is also represented on the tracing board. We have the complementarity of the sun and the moon, the intermediate level of the psyche. The idea of duality is represented by the Doric and Corinthian columns. This law of duality is also represented in terms of the individual by the two parallel lines, which bind the point within the circle. For the law of duality, however, anything that separates from the divine source, its complement also exists to provide a balance to it. And the symbols on the tracing board, while I'm not saying are specifically Kabbalistic, they may be Jungian archetypes in that sense, yin and yang of our lives. But the rule of three is also represented on the tracing board. And these are the three agencies which extend through all the levels of the lodge, and the architectural styles convey this idea. It's an idea that's borrowed from Vitruvius, whether it was borrowed in the early 18th century by the antiquarians who set up the Premier Grand Lodge, or whether it was part of the mysteries discussed in the 17th century lodges, we don't know. But certainly, again, we have a psyche, an active, exuberant, creative agency represented by the Corinthian column, a passive, reflective, traditional agency represented by the Doric column, and a balance, conscious, coordinating agency represented by the Ionic column. I don't think it's Kabbalistic necessarily, but again, we're dealing with very general psychological views, and it probably says more about the facility of the Kabbalah to deal with archetypes than it says about the structure and image of Freemasonry. Now, I wanted to move on from this. I do deal in the paper with the idea of the craft as a way of personal growth, and the symbolism of, for example, Jacob's ladder offering a pathway in the east-west direction from the physical plane to the spiritual plane. But I think it is a very old approach to individual development, and I think I'm very interested in Kirk McNulty's view of how a candidate receiving the ceremony, or being part of the ceremony, can symbolically think about the nature of his own psyche. But having finished the paper and sort of reviewing it, one is always tempted to add more or cite more footnotes, or there are two important things that I immediately think I left out of the paper. And one is the idea of the men's house. It occurred to me because I was shuffling books around from one box to another, and then from one box to another, and I never seem to get rid of all my books. I never throw a book out, but I just move them from one box to another from time to time. And I came across this idea. It immediately sprang out at me, a book by Joseph Fort Newton. I'm sure you've all heard of him. The Men's House, Masonic Papers and Addresses. He doesn't go into much detail, and it's part of the paper that I wish I'd thought of. But there is a proposition that Freemasonry does form a safe place for men to grow, to have mentors, to be initiated. We're not talking about, tribal initiations, but maybe we are. Is there a safe place where the older men of the tribe hand on their knowledge, experience, and wisdom to the younger blokes in the tribe? A safe space for men to share their secrets away from the rest of the world. It's an interesting proposition. Now, Newton doesn't deal with it in a way that I am comfortable with. He just accepts it's all true, and of course, the men's house must have been, just as valuable a thing as the temple or the home in early days. But it's an interesting proposition, and one that I wish I'd spent more time on when I was thinking about this paper. The other thing that occurred to me, rereading the paper, is perhaps a little bit like the Men's House, the idea of hospitality and our brotherhood in terms of, well, it's in terms of visiting, but also sharing hospitality. In that sense, it really only occurred to me a little while ago after a rehearsal, and one of the lodges I'm a member of, the average age is still about 42, I think, and the young blokes there are very keen on their Freemasonry and happy to give up their Sunday mornings for rehearsal. And in the conversation, we were talking about some of the older members of the lodge, and it occurred to me that at the very basic level, the very least we can give a brother when he turns up to lodge is a feed and a drink. Doesn't matter what's going on in the lodge room per se. But the South is very important from that perspective. We're actually giving, it's Maslow's pyramid, I think it's Maslow, isn't it? The idea of the pyramid of needs. At the very basic need of a human being is to have food, drink, and shelter. And we provide that in ourselves. Now, that too may be a good reason. What is Freemasonry for? We provide very basic needs on that basis, on a brotherhood kind of basis, to any brother that turns up in our lodge. We at least give him a feed and a drink. Whatever else is going on, that's pretty basic. So I think I'll leave it there. I want this to be a two-way thing. I don't think I've got all the answers, or I hope I've been of some interest, and I'm happy to take questions or develop some of these ideas. But thank you for your attention. It's great that you've. I must say, I was very disappointed that this tour has turned out to be a Zoom. I would much rather be meeting with you in lodge face to face, but certainly I'll be happy to go to Sydney or happy to go to Brisbane, but not if I can't come home. Oh, I have to go into quarantine for 14 days. It's not something that I can do to myself. But in any event, I'm glad to see your smiling faces on Zoom, and I hope that paper is of some interest.